I got off the bus with my backpack on and my shirt sticking to my back from the muggy heat. The air smelled of dry earth and cut grass, and the sun beat down directly on my face, forcing my eyes to narrow. The entrance to the training center was a simple structure, surrounded by high walls and an iron gate painted dark green. Inside, the routine was already taking place in silence. Rhythmic steps, firm voices, nothing out of place. Right at the entrance, I saw him, standing with his hands behind him, in a firm position, his uniform aligned, his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. But even from a distance, you could see the power of his gaze, direct, penetrating, as if he were weighing every inch of me without saying a word. He didn't blink, he just looked at me. In that instant, everything seemed to slow down. The sounds disappeared for a second, and all that was left was the sound of my own chest beating too fast for the moment. I struggled to keep my gaze back. Only he was different from the other officers. There was something more than hierarchy there. Something that left me not knowing whether to lower my eyes or keep staring. It only took a second, maybe two. Then he turned his face away, turned around, and disappeared down the corridor. But that look had already been imprinted, and I knew he had felt it too. They called him Colonel Duarte. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. When he crossed the courtyard, the sound of his boots hitting the ground was louder than any shout. The recruits lined up, but it was his gaze that aligned the spirit. It was as if he knew everything, all the time. He had a kind of presence that made the air heavy. I never saw him smile, not once. And yet, it was impossible not to look. You could tell he was no ordinary man. His shoulders were straight, his uniform always impeccable, every gesture millimetrically contained, an absurd amount of control. But it was in his silence that the danger lay, what wasn't said. What was in his eyes when they crossed mine, and as if he was trying to hide something and at the same time challenging me to find out. In the cleaning ward, I was placed next to Louise, the only one who didn't seem to be walking around with fear in his back. Light brown, short hair, quiet manner. About 3 years older than me, he had already been to another training center before coming here. "You have the face of someone who can't swallow an order quietly," he said, while we were cleaning the plumbing in the north wing. "And you have the face of someone who's been beaten up enough to stay out of it," I retorted. He laughed quietly. "Fair enough, but here, the less you show up, the better." Louise was observant, but he didn't invade. He let me breathe. And that, in there, was already a lot. The truth is that I wasn't there by choice. It was a second chance, they said. After a nasty fight with an older guy in town, something of impulsiveness, of too much accumulated anger, the judge gave me two options: serve time as a juvenile or enter the rehabilitation program at a military center. I chose to disappear, stay away, erase my name, erase everything. I just didn't expect that in the midst of this erasure, I would bump into a man like him, a man who looked at me as if he knew the mess inside me, a man who, even if he was quiet, made me more restless than any scream. And the worst part, it was only the beginning. It was a hot afternoon, the kind that makes your uniform stick to your back without any effort. The sun was beating down, but the work had to be done. I'd been told to cut the grass in the side yard. I stood there, under the cloudless sky, with the noise of the brush cutter filling everything around me, almost like a continuous ringing in my ears. The smell of cut grass rose strongly, mixed with the hot earth and the oil from the machine. Sweat dripped down his temples, sticking dust to his face. Being there alone had become a relief. It was the only moment of the day when I didn't have to face anyone or pretend anything. But he appeared out of nowhere. The sound of his boots drowned out the sound of the brush cutter. I turned off the engine and looked up. He was already there, standing at the edge of the shed's shade, watching in silence. His arms crossed, his eyes scanning the yard as if to make sure no one else was around. He approached calmly. "So you're the rude one?" he said, his voice low and sharp. There was no anger in his tone, just firmness, and a kind of curiosity that made me tense up even more. He tilted his head slightly. his eyes still glued to mine. "I expect you to behave yourself here. We don't tolerate disrespect." "Yes, sir," I replied. Too quickly, almost on impulse, he took another step, enough for me to feel the warmth of his body even in the sun. The smell of soap from his uniform and worn leather from his belt mixed with the heavy afternoon air. It was as if he surrounded me with just his presence. And then he added, "Some of your kind have been here before, and I've put them all on the right track." Very quickly. It went right through me. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like certainty, like someone who knows the end of the story before it begins. He then turned his back and walked to the door of the main building. When he got there, he stopped. He turned his face towards me and stared at me for a few seconds in silence, as if he still had something to say or something he was waiting for me to say. After that, he went inside, but the air remained heavy, as if something had stayed there with him. I turned the brush cutter back on, but I couldn't stop hearing his voice echoing in my head, or forget the way he looked at me. The storm started out of nowhere. The sky darkened as if it were night, and the wind blew hard, blowing dust and dry leaves across the yard. The siren sounded warning of a lockdown. Everyone ran to the main barracks except me. I was assigned to reorganize some boxes in the maintenance shed, and there I stayed, alone, with the rain hammering down on the metal roof, lightning tearing through the sky, and the sound of thunder drowning everything out. The light failed about 3 times before going out for good. I was left with only the gray light outside, filtered through the dirty windows. The smell of wet wood and rust filled the air. The wind entered through a crack in the poorly closed door, making the leaves on the ground move slowly, as if they had life. And then he came in. He opened the door with force, his wet boots marking the floor. His eyes swept the shed until he found me. He didn't say a word. He closed the door behind him. The storm raged outside, but the silence inside was even heavier. I took a step back, not quite understanding, and it was at that moment that he came. Without hesitation, he took a firm hold of my neck and turned me to face the wall. He pushed me against it with his body glued to mine. The cold concrete touched my forehead. My hands were open, stuck there, not knowing whether to react or tremble. His body pressed against my back, his warmth seeping through the fabric of my uniform. His breath came hot, too close to my ear. "What are you doing here?" he said, low, slurred, as if he wasn't speaking with his mouth, but with something much deeper. His voice entered me entirely. It didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a confession dressed up as authority. I didn't answer. I could only feel the sound of the rain outside, being drowned out by the sound of my own chest. He stayed like that for a few seconds, as if he was waiting for something or controlling himself not to do more. And then he let go of my neck slowly. I took a step back, turned my face, but he was already walking away. He walked to the door, stopped. He turned his face to me, looked at me as if he wanted to record that image, and then he left. The rain continued, but inside, I was the one shivering. The next day, everything seemed to go on as usual, with the same sounds, the same commands echoing through the corridors, the clatter of boots in the courtyards, the whistling of the wind between the buildings, and even the smell of bitter coffee coming from the cafeteria. But inside me, everything was different. It was as if the silence between the sounds shouted louder than any order I had ever received there. His presence now carried a different density. Whenever the colonel passed by, I felt a tightness in my stomach and a strange weight on my back, as if my body alone remembered his touch. His warmth so close to mine, his low voice saying it in my ear, the cold wall against my face. It wasn't exactly fear, but it wasn't safety either. It was a confusing mixture that I didn't know where to put. I spent the whole morning avoiding running into him. I plunged myself into the most repetitive tasks possible just so I wouldn't think too much. But on the way back from the warehouse, after delivering some tools, I saw his office door ajar, and he was in there, alone, sitting at his desk with some papers in his hand. but his gaze lost, fixed on nothing. I don't know if it was courage or just impulse, but my feet moved before my head. I pushed the door open calmly, took a deep breath, and entered. He looked up and stared at me without surprise, as if he knew the moment was coming, as if he had been waiting for it. "Why don't you like my face?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my chest was beating faster than it should. He watched me for a moment and seemed to stretch, then leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with the calmness of someone who doesn't need to rush to command respect. His gaze lingered on my face longer than any other officer would have allowed. "Because you remind me of someone," he said at last, in a neutral tone, unaffected by the question. "Maybe one day I'll tell you." That answer disarmed me. It wasn't what I expected to hear, and at the same time, it made sense in a way I couldn't explain. Before I could think of anything else to say, he leaned forward, collected the papers from the table, and finished, closing the subject as only he knew how. "Now go do your job." I stood still for a few seconds, waiting perhaps for a gesture, a different look, a word that would break down the barrier he himself had built, but nothing came. He just looked at me with that solid calm, almost impassive, but with something behind his eyes, something that wasn't indifference. I left the room with a strange feeling of having come closer to him than ever before, and at the same time, of having been kept in exactly the same place. But inside, I already knew something in him recognized something in me. And maybe that's why he looked that way, as if he wanted to keep me away, and at the same time, closer and closer. 2 days later, the afternoon was already turning into evening when I was told to finish a job in the courtyard. I was just finishing tidying up the tools at the side of the shed, sweaty, my hands dirty with dirt and grease, when I heard his footsteps approaching. It was impossible not to recognize the sound of Duarte's boots, always firm, always present, as if the ground obeyed the weight of each step. He passed me without stopping, but before moving on, he threw the order over his shoulder in that voice that left no room for questioning. "When you've finished here, go to the storeroom. I want those boxes organized. They're lying on the floor as if no one had been there for days." I didn't look directly at him. I just shook my head and said a muffled, "Yes, sir," my eyes still on the tools. The sun descended slowly, tinging everything with that heavy late afternoon orange. And there I was, alone, among badly stacked boxes, and a silence that only grew. The room was stuffy, the air still, and the shadows inside the warehouse were gradually swallowing everything up. It was already dark enough for me to consider calling it a night. I closed one of the larger boxes, wiped my hands on my pants, and prepared to leave in the direction of the dormitory. It was at that moment that the back door opened wide. His silhouette filled the doorway even before the light spread out. It was him, Duarte. The same rigid manner as always, his shoulders firm, his breathing contained, but there was something different in his gaze. A rush, a contained anger that I couldn't tell if it was against me or against himself. He entered without a word, closing the door behind him with a dry slam. His steps were decisive, straight, and before I knew it, he was too close. His hand gripped my shirt tightly, and in one swift movement, he pushed me against the wall. My back hit the concrete, and before I could react, he was there, glued to my body, his breath hot on my face. Without warning, without hesitation, he kissed me. It was a raw, urgent kiss, full of everything that had been swallowed up in the silences of these days. His body pressed mine hard against the wall, as if to erase the distance he himself had created. His hands held my shoulders firmly, and the kiss was intense, heavy, as if he wanted to get something out of him through me. I couldn't think of anything. I just felt it. The taste of anger, of desire, of confession, the warmth of his skin through the fabric of our uniforms, the way he pulled me close, as if he was trying to resolve all conflicts with a single gesture. And as much as everything inside me screamed about what could or couldn't happen there, my body couldn't resist. I couldn't. The atmosphere had heated up so much that it was no longer possible to pretend that it was just an impulse or a mistake. His breath was panting against my mouth, and his fingers dug into my waist as if they wanted to hold me in that instant. Then we heard footsteps, Outside, someone was approaching the storeroom, first from a distance, then closer and closer. We both froze. His gaze changed at the same moment, desire giving way to alertness. He moved away from me quickly, straightened his uniform with military precision, and without saying a word, turned towards the back door. He opened it slowly, silently, and disappeared into the darkness of the courtyard. I stood there alone, with my body still warm, my breathing ragged, and the taste of him in my mouth, while footsteps passed outside, without knowing, without imagining what almost happened in there, or maybe what had already happened. It was Friday afternoon, and the mood in the barracks was lighter than usual. Some of the troops had been released for the weekend, and I was part of the group that could leave for 2 days. The rucksack on my back weighed less than usual, and even with the dry heat sticking to my skin, I walked as if I were breathing freedom for the first time in days. I turned the corner, already outside the barracks walls, with the sun beating down on my side and a little dust in the air, when a black car with dark windows slowed down and stopped next to me. I looked around suspiciously, trying to see who it was. The window slowly lowered, and before I could even see the face, the silhouette gave me away. It was him, Duarte. He was wearing a simple black shirt, without his uniform, but still with that posture that never changed. His eyes were hidden behind sunglasses, his expression as closed as ever. And yet there was something there, something looser, more human. His voice came thick and direct, as always, but this time with a different tone, hard to explain. "Do you want a lift?" I didn't even think. I just answered in a tone that came out too naturally. "I do." He nodded briefly and unlocked the passenger door. I got in. The interior of the car was cool, the sound turned down very low, just instrumental jazz playing in the background. For a moment, the silence enveloped us like a heavy blanket, not uncomfortable, but full of everything that had never been said. He then turned his face a little, his eyes still on the road. "Where do you live?" I answered the name of the neighborhood almost without looking at him. He mumbled, with a half smile at the corner of his mouth. "Do you want to stop off first?" At that moment, it wasn't the question itself, but the way he asked it. The pause between words, the deeper tone, the heat that spread through my body was the answer before my mouth even opened. I knew what he meant, and he knew that I knew, but even so, I only replied with a restrained smile and a low voice. "Of course. Yes, we will." And then he accelerated. The car slid down the road with the sun dipping low on the horizon, and there I was, sitting next to a man who until yesterday had only existed within walls, rules, hierarchy, and now looked at me with a different intention, without hiding it. At that moment, it was no longer about orders, nor about right or wrong. It was about what was about to happen. The silence between us continued for much of the journey. Just the low sound of the engine and the headlights cutting across the road. But even without a word being exchanged, the car seemed loaded with everything that had been accumulating for days. The looks, the touches, the interrupted kisses, the unspoken desires. I stared out of the window pretending to be calm, but my whole body already knew what was about to happen. After a few minutes, he turned the car down a quieter, almost traffic-free street, surrounded by trees and discreet houses. Then, without saying a word, he stopped in front of a house with a simple facade, an automatic gate, and its lights off. He picked up the control on the dashboard, pressed a button, and the gate began to open slowly. The sound of the engine slowing down echoed in the garage. He parked with precision, turned off the car, and got out. He didn't look back. He just said, in that low, firm voice I already knew well, "Come." I followed him without a second thought. Inside, the house was quiet, clean, and organized, just like him. Few furnishings, everything in neutral tones without excess, as if it reflected exactly what he was on the outside. But inside, in the enclosed space, in the intimacy of that place, he was no longer just the colonel. As soon as he closed the door behind me, he turned around, and he didn't wait. He came straight in, without words, without hesitation. He kissed me with the same restrained force as before, only now without fear of being interrupted, without thin walls, without footsteps outside. He pushed me slowly against the wall of the room, our bodies pressed together, our breaths mingling, his hands running over my arms, waist, face, as if he wanted to memorize every part of what he had already desired in silence. This time, there was no escape, no back doors, no shadows. That day, we finished what we started in the storeroom. And it wasn't just about desire, it was about allowing ourselves, about crossing a line that had been erased long ago, about discovering that what existed between us was stronger than the rule, than guilt, than silence. After everything, when the silence returned and our bodies relaxed in the warmth of the room, there was no hurry, no explanations, no promises. We lay there for a while, side by side, our breathing still ragged and each other's touch marked on our skin, as if that night had been less of an outburst and more of a silent reckoning with everything we had repressed up to that point. We didn't talk about what it meant, and curiously, we didn't need to. There was an implicit, almost respectful understanding that that moment was what it was, real, inevitable, and ours. Shortly afterwards, we were in the car again, crossing the empty road in the first light of day. The way back was quiet, but different from the silence on the way out. Now, what surrounded us was a filled silence. There was no discomfort, no rush, just that peaceful pause that only exists when something has been experienced in its entirety. When he stopped at the corner of my street, he just looked at me sideways, with an almost imperceptible nod of his head, and I understood that it was the most he could give me at that moment. And even then, it was a lot. I went downstairs, walked slowly to my house, and that night I slept with his scent clinging to my skin, as if his body hadn't completely returned. On Monday morning, returning to the barracks brought back the weight of the routine, the automatic gestures, the noise of the commands, the lined ranks, the cold stares. But inside, something in me had shifted, as if I no longer fit into exactly the same shapes as before. And then I saw him. Duarte was in the courtyard, as always, firm, impassive, surrounded by rules and authority. But when our eyes met through the corridors of uniforms and protocols, I saw something new in his gaze, something quieter, deeper, that only I would be able to see. It wasn't affection. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition, as if he knew that from that weekend onwards there was something between us that could no longer be undone, even if it was never said out loud. The day went on like all the others, with no detours, no questions, no explanations. But that gaze remained locked on me, crossing the empty spaces like a living reminder of everything that had happened. And I knew, with a silent certainty, that no matter how much everything seemed the same, something essential between the two of us had already changed. Definitely. In the early hours of Tuesday morning, the barracks slept in a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the sound of a lamp humming faintly above the dormitory door. I was lying on my side, my eyes open for hours, unable to close my mind or body, reliving Saturday night as if I were still inside it. The light in the dormitory was still on, giving the room a pale, almost suspended tone, as if time wasn't running as it should. Then I heard the subtle sound of the doorknob turning. The door opened slowly, taking extreme care not to attract the attention of those sleeping in the other beds. The creak was slight, almost imperceptible, but I was already too awake to ignore any sound. I lifted my head slowly, without making any sudden movements, and when my eyes reached the doorway, I saw his shadow. Duarte. He stood still for a second, his eyes fixed on me, his body half hidden by the still ajar door. He didn't say anything, as usual. He just made a gesture with his head, short, restrained, but clear, calling me. My heart raced instantly, as if I'd just woken up for real at that moment. I got up quietly, put on a t-shirt, slippers, and walked with light steps to the door, taking care not to wake anyone. When I came out, he had already started walking down the corridor. and I followed him, guided by the muffled sound of his footsteps and the almost electric tension that filled the space between the two of us. We entered his office in silence. As soon as the door closed behind me, he turned the key in the lock firmly, as if he knew exactly what he wanted to do there. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He just turned, stared at me for a second that seemed to last much longer, and then approached in a decisive, direct way, his gaze hotter than ever. His mouth met mine urgently, without words. A dense, deep kiss that didn't ask for permission, but didn't demand an explanation either. His hands went firmly around my waist and back, pulling my body against his with a strength that wasn't aggressive. It was need. A kind of desire that no longer needed to be hidden. Not there, not then, not after everything that had already passed between us. The kiss grew as if time had stopped outside that room, as if the whole world existed only there, between those walls, between those two bodies that had finally understood that there was no longer any pretending that it didn't exist. His mouth found mine with urgency, as if all the silence of the previous days had been concentrated in that gesture. The kiss was hot, firm, full of everything that had been contained for too long. His hands explored my body without haste, but with a certainty that made each touch seem necessary, inevitable, almost vital. Amid the heat of our bodies meeting and our breaths intertwining, he guided me to the office desk, the same desk where, so many times, he had given me orders, read reports, corrected my posture. Now it became something else, an intimate setting, ours. With a firm gesture, he moved the papers aside, pushed a folder aside, and lifted me up slowly, as if he knew exactly the way. I sat on the cold edge, feeling the contrast between his touch and the surface of the furniture. His gaze was intense, direct, but there was a surrender there that I had never seen before. It wasn't just about desire anymore. It was about freedom, about finally allowing. We undressed as if each piece of clothing was a weight that needed to fall off, until there was nothing left between us. No fabric, no silence, no distance. And there, on that table, in the place where control reigned, we made love with a hunger that wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, denser, made up of everything that had been repressed, everything that couldn't be said out loud, but was now said with the whole body. The touches were slow at first, careful, as if we were discovering new territory, but gradually they became more intense, more surrendered, as if the urgency that guided us was stronger than the fear of being caught or the weight of any rules that existed outside. The table creaked under our movements, and yet it seemed firm, as if it held not only our bodies, but the whole moment. And in every gesture, in every accelerated breath, there was a kind of truth that neither of us could deny any longer. When everything had passed, when our bodies had calmed down and the sweat had mixed with the memory of the touch, we stayed there for a while. The silence returned, but now it wasn't discomfort. It was complicity, a pause that said, "This happened. This is real." And even if no one ever knew, even if, when we left that room, everything had to go back to the way it was, we both already knew. That table, that moment, had changed everything. We were still there, our bodies tired, our breath slower, and the air in the room filled with that damp, dense heat that only exists after desire. The low light from the lamp cast soft shadows across the floor, and the silence that surrounded us was different now. It was no longer tense. It was whole, real, almost calm. Duarte was sitting in the chair next to me, his shirt unbuttoned, his chest still damp and his gaze lost somewhere between the wall and my skin. I continued to sit on the edge of the table, watching him with the kind of attention that only comes after the body has said everything the mouth hasn't had the courage to. It was then that, breaking that dense silence, my voice came out, low but firm. That day, when you told me that I reminded you of someone, who was it? He didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, as if he were reliving a memory he didn't want to touch. His jaw moved once, his neck tensed, as if he'd swallowed something that got stuck in the way, Only then did he turn his face towards me and look at me with a different look, more worn, more human. I'm not sure, he said in a low, almost hoarse tone, as if he was still choosing each word carefully. Maybe it's your rebelliousness. The way you defy everything and everyone, even when you don't say anything. I was just like you. That answer went through me in a strange way. It wasn't just about me. It was about him too. Duarte wasn't just seeing me. He was seeing himself in me. The part he had hidden for too long. The part that still burned inside, even under the weight of the uniform, the years of command. I remained silent, not for lack of anything to say, but out of respect for that rare moment when he opened a crack, a small gap in that wall that never let anyone through. And that early morning, locked in the office, surrounded by papers, walls, and unspoken truths, I understood that what was between us wasn't just desire. It was a mirror. It was past, present, and the risk of a future that neither of us knew if we would have the courage to live. There are only 3 days left until my time here in the barracks comes to an end. 3 days. And as much as I counted down the days to leave when I arrived, now, with my backpack almost packed, my heart is starting to squeeze in a way I didn't expect. It's just that I've become attached to him. Duarte has that rough, closed-off way about him, always with a firm voice and a look that seems to go right through you. But behind that, there's someone who carries too much on his chest and has learned to hide it all behind a uniform. And even without saying much, he showed me that sometimes those who try to hide the most need to be seen the most. And I saw him. I saw the man behind the command, the desire behind the silence, and the affection hidden in the smallest gestures, the most restrained touches, the glances that took too long. Now, with so little time left, what's on my mind is whether he'll miss me, whether he'll keep looking for me in the corridors even after I'm no longer there, if somehow he's become attached too. And the truth is that I want to keep seeing him. I want to see that hard look in his eyes again, which, when it softens, says everything without having to say anything. So, that's it. That's the end of this story for now. But when I get out of here, I'll come back to tell you if we met again, if he came to me, or if it's all just a memory, something that was as intense as it was impossible. And if you like this story, you already know, leave your like, activate the notifications, and take a look at the comments because the uncut version is there waiting for you. See you there. Or, who knows, maybe we'll meet. Love, Kai.